Uh, I'm afraid I can't cash this check today.
Betty Johnson smoothed her navy blue dress and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror one last time. At 72, she still carried herself with the posture of the elementary school teacher she'd been for 38 years. Gentle morning sounds, papers shuffling. Every third Tuesday of the month, like clockwork, she followed the same routine. Social Security check went to the credit union. Pension check got deposited at the community bank. But her monthly U.S. Treasury check, the one from her federal retirement benefits, that always went to First National. She'd been banking there for 12 years. Same branch, same familiar faces behind the counter. Well, mostly the same faces. There were more young people working there lately. Betty opened her well-organized purse and double-checked her contents. Driver's license in the front pocket, exactly where it belonged. U.S. Treasury check endorsed with her careful signature. Deposit slip filled out in her precise handwriting. Everything in order, just as she taught her third graders to be prepared. Purse closing with a soft snap. The morning air was crisp as she walked the 3 blocks to First National. She'd made this walk so many times she could do it with her eyes closed. Past the coffee shop where she sometimes treated herself to a small decaf. Past the flower shop with its cheerful yellow mums in the window. Betty pushed through the bank's glass doors, expecting nothing more complicated than a 5-minute transaction. Door chime, ambient bank sounds. The lobby was moderately busy for a Tuesday morning. Betty took her place in the customer service line, behind a young mother with a fidgeting toddler and a businessman checking his phone. She recognized the manager, Patricia Valdez, speaking with a customer at her desk. She nodded politely to the security guard, Carl, who'd been there almost as long as she'd been a customer. When her turn came, Betty approached the teller window with her usual quiet confidence. The nameplate read Brandon Mitchell. She didn't recognize him, probably one of the new hires. "Good morning," Betty said warmly, sliding her check and ID through the window. "I'd like to cash this, please." Brandon was maybe 25, with carefully styled hair and a crisp white shirt. He glanced at Betty, then at her documents. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Uncomfortable pause. "This is a Treasury check," he said, as if she might not know. "Yes, it's my monthly federal retirement benefit. I've been cashing them here for years." Brandon picked up the check, holding it up to the light. He examined it front and back, then set it down and stared at Betty's ID for a long moment. "I'm going to need to verify this," he said. Betty felt a small flutter of confusion. Of course, that's fine. But instead of the usual quick computer verification, Brandon called over his supervisor. The two of them spoke in hushed tones, glancing repeatedly at Betty and her documents. Other customers were starting to notice. Whispers, shuffling feet, growing tension. The supervisor, a woman Betty didn't recognize, shook her head after examining the check. They whispered some more. "Ma'am," Brandon said finally, his voice formal and cold. "I'm afraid I can't cash this check today." Betty blinked. "I'm sorry. We're unable to verify the authenticity of this Treasury check. Our policy requires additional documentation for large government checks." "Additional documentation?" Betty's voice remained calm, but her hands had begun to tremble slightly. "I've been cashing these checks here for over a decade. This is my bank." "Do you have a bank statement showing regular deposits, proof of employment with the federal government?" Betty felt heat rising in her cheeks. Around her, she could sense other customers listening, watching. The young mother had stopped trying to quiet her toddler. The businessman had lowered his phone. "I'm retired," Betty said, her voice still steady but growing firmer. "This is my retirement benefit. I have my ID, which you can see matches the check exactly." Brandon's expression didn't change. "I understand your frustration, ma'am, but without proper verification, I cannot process this transaction. Bank policy." "Could I speak with Mrs. Morrison?" Betty asked, nomming the manager she'd worked with for years. "She knows me." "Mrs. Morrison is no longer with this branch. Ms. Valdez is the current manager, but she's with a customer." Betty glanced toward Patricia Valdez's desk. She was indeed speaking with someone, a white man in his 30s, laughing at something he'd said. Uncomfortable silence stretching. "So what exactly do you suggest I do?" Betty asked. "You could try another branch, or contact the Treasury Department directly to verify the check's authenticity." The words hit Betty like a slap. In 38 years of teaching, she dealt with difficult situations, challenging parents, administrative bureaucracy. But she'd never been made to feel like a criminal for simply trying to access her own money. I see, she said quietly. With as much dignity as she could muster, Betty gathered her documents. Her hands shook only slightly as she folded the check and slipped it back into her purse. She nodded politely to Brandon as if he'd simply told her the weather forecast. Footsteps on marble floor, door chime. But as she walked toward the exit, Betty caught sight of something that stopped her cold. At the window next to Brandon's, another teller was cheerfully cashing a check for an elderly white man. No additional verification, no hushed consultations, no questions about documentation. Just routine, respectful service. Phone ringing, ambient sounds of a small apartment. Betty sat in her living room armchair, the same one where she'd graded thousands of spelling tests and math worksheets over the years. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, but her chest still felt tight with a mixture of anger and humiliation. She stared at the phone for 10 minutes before picking it up. Maya Johnson Chen answered on the third ring. Hi, Grandma Betty, how are you? Betty paused, pride wrestling with practicality. I'm fine, sweetheart, how are you? Good, just getting ready for work. Wait, Maya's voice sharpened with concern. You sound upset, what's wrong? Betty had raised Maya from age 8, after Maya's parents died in a car accident. She'd learned to read her granddaughter's moods from the slightest change in tone, but Maya had learned the same skill in reverse. It's probably nothing, Betty began, then stopped herself. Actually, no, it's not nothing. Gentle sounds of Maya settling into a chair. So Betty did. She described the monthly routine, the new teller, the refusal, the humiliation of being questioned in front of other customers. She kept her voice steady, factual, like she was reporting on a student's behavior rather than her own treatment. He said he needed additional documentation, Betty finished, for a check I've been cashing there for 12 years. Maya was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. Grandma, did you see how they treated other customers? There was a gentleman at the next window, white gentleman about my age. They cashed his check with no questions at all. What kind of check? I couldn't see exactly, but it looked official. Government issued, maybe. Another pause. Maya worked for a nonprofit that helped people navigate housing discrimination. She'd seen enough bias to recognize the patterns. Grandma, this isn't about bank policy. This is discrimination. Betty had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it said aloud made it real in a way that frightened her. I don't want to make trouble, Maya. You didn't make trouble, they did. Maya's voice was firm but gentle. And we're going to fix it. How? Leave that to me. Can you do me a favor? Write down everything you remember about today. Every detail, the teller's name, what time it was, what exactly he said, what you observed about other customers. Everything. Maya, I really don't want to cause a fuss. Grandma, Maya's voice carried the same authority Betty had once used to quiet unruly classrooms. You taught me that standing up for what's right isn't causing a fuss. It's doing your job as a citizen. Soft sound of agreement. I'll write it down, Betty said. Goods and Grandma, tomorrow morning I'm coming with you to that bank. Door chime, busier bank sounds. Maya arrived at Betty's house at 9 a.m. sharp, dressed in her best professional outfit. A navy blazer that meant business and an expression that suggested she'd done her homework. Oh, she had. Ready, she asked her grandmother. Betty nodded, gripping her purse a little tighter than usual. The same bank lobby, but with Maya by her side, Betty felt different, stronger. Maya's presence seemed to change the very air around them. They approached Brandon Mitchell's window. He looked up, recognized Betty, and his expression immediately became guarded. Good morning, Maya said pleasantly. I'm Maya Johnson Chen, and this is my grandmother, Betty Johnson. I understand there was some confusion yesterday about cashing her Treasury check. Brandon glanced nervously toward the manager's office. I explained the bank's verification policy. Could you walk me through that policy? Maya interrupted, her voice still pleasant but with steel underneath. Specifically, what additional documentation is required for cashing U.S. Treasury checks? Well, for large amounts. How large is large? Let me get my supervisor. Footsteps approaching. Patricia Valdez appeared beside Brandon, her smile professional but wary. I'm Patricia Valdez, branch manager. How can I help you today? Maya extended her hand. Maya Johnson Chen, I'm here regarding the discrimination my grandmother experienced yesterday when trying to cash her legitimate Treasury check. The word discrimination hung in the air like a challenge. Patricia's smile flickered. I'm sure there was simply a misunderstanding about our verification procedures. What are those procedures exactly? Maya asked. Because according to the Treasury Department's website, which I reviewed this morning, legitimate Treasury checks can be verified through your standard banking systems within 60 seconds. Uncomfortable silence. Sometimes additional steps are necessary for customer protection. Whose protection? Maya's voice remained level. My grandmother has been banking here for 12 years. She brought proper identification. The check is legitimate Treasury issue. What exactly required protection? Patricia exchanged glances with Brandon. Perhaps we could discuss this privately in my office. I think we should discuss it right here, Maya said, since this is where the discrimination occurred. The word again, other customers were beginning to notice the tension. Ma'am, Patricia said, her voice taking on a harder edge, I need to ask you to lower your voice. If you continue to disrupt our business. I'm disrupting your business, Maya's eyebrows rose. By asking why you refuse to provide standard banking services to a customer based on her appearance. That's not what happened. Then what did happen? Walk me through your standard procedure for cashing Treasury checks. Patricia was trapped. Any answer would either admit to discrimination or reveal that no such procedure existed. I think this conversation is over, Patricia said finally. If you have concerns about our service, you can file a complaint through corporate channels. Maya nodded slowly. Thank you. That's exactly what I plan to do, along with filing complaints with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the Treasury Department's Office of Inspector General. Sharp intake of breaths. She'd done her research. These weren't empty threats. However, Maya continued, I'm willing to give you one opportunity to resolve this properly. Cash my grandmother's check right now with the respect and service she deserves, and we can consider this a learning experience rather than a federal case. Patricia looked at Betty, then at Maya, then at the growing number of customers who were now openly watching the exchange. Brandon, she said quietly, please process Mrs. Johnson's transaction. But you said, Brandon began. Process the transaction. Computer keys tapping, printer sounds. Brandon's hands shook slightly as he handled Betty's check and ID. The verification took exactly 43 seconds. He counted out the cash with exaggerated care, as if afraid of making any additional mistakes. Thank you, Betty said graciously, accepting her money. But Maya wasn't finished. Ms. Valdez, I assume you'll be reviewing your staff training to ensure this doesn't happen to other customers. Of course, Patricia said through gritted teeth. Excellent, I'll follow up in a few weeks to see how that's progressing. As they walked toward the exit, Maya's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and smiled grimly. What is it? Betty asked. I posted about this on the community Facebook page last night. That's my friend Sandra. She says 3 other people have messaged her about similar experiences at this same branch. Betty stopped walking. 3 others. 3 that responded in the last 12 hours. There are probably more. Door chime as they exit. Maya, Betty said quietly, I think this is bigger than just my check. I think you're right, Grandma, and that means we can't let it go. Typing sounds, papers rustling, phone conversations. Maya's dining room table had transformed into a command center. Printed articles about banking discrimination, copies of federal regulations, phone numbers for complaint hotlines. Her laptop showed multiple browser tabs, CFPB complaint forms, Treasury Department contact information, legal aid resources. Betty sat across from her, methodically writing out her experience in her careful teacher's handwriting. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination in places of public accommodation, Maya read aloud from her laptop. That includes banks. The Fair Credit Reporting Act requires that they have legitimate reasons for refusing service, and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act specifically addresses this kind of treatment. She looked up at Betty. Grandma, what they did to you wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. But proving it, Betty trailed off. That's where documentation comes in. Maya gestured to the papers spread between them. Your written account, the names of witnesses, the time and date, the different treatment you observed, it all matters. Phone ringings. Maya answered, hello. Maya, this is Sandra Rodriguez from the community page. I have those names for you. Great, let me grab a pens. Maya scribbled notes as Sandra spoke. Okay, so we have Diane Watson, retired nurse, Jennifer Lopez works at the school district, and Carl Washington, veteran, all had problems at First National in the past 6 months. The same teller. Two of them dealt with Brandon Mitchell. One had issues with another teller who's no longer there. But the pattern is the same, extra verification requirements, delays, eventually being told to try other branches. Maya felt a familiar anger building, the same feeling she got when helping families fight housing discrimination. Individual incidents could be explained away, but patterns revealed systemic problems. Sandra, could you ask them if they'd be willing to file complaints, officially? I already did. They're all interested, but they want to know it won't just disappear into some bureaucratic black hole. Maya looked at her grandmother, who was still writing in her careful script. Tell them it won't. Federal agencies have to respond to discrimination complaints, and when multiple people file complaints about the same institution. It gets their attention, Sandra finished. Exactly. After Maya hung up, Betty looked up from her writing. 4 people, Maya's 4 people we know about. In 6 months at one branch, Maya shook her head. There are probably others who didn't report it, didn't think they could do anything about it. Betty set down her pen, so what do we do? Maya was already opening a new browser tab. We file formal complaints. CFPB handles consumer protection. The OCC regulates national banks. Treasury's Inspector General investigates federal benefit issues. We hit them from all angles. Will it work? Maya met her grandmother's eyes. I don't know, but I know what happens if we don't try. Keyboard typing, phone hold music, office ambient sounds. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's online complaint form was surprisingly straightforward. Maya had expected bureaucratic complexity, but the site seemed designed for real people with real problems. Financial product or service, Maya read aloud as she typed. Bank account or service, checking account, problem category, trouble using a debit or ATM card. That's not quite right, Betty said, looking over her shoulder. Close enough, the description box is where we tell the real story. Maya's fingers flew over the keyboard. On November 15th, my 72-year-old grandmother was refused service when attempting to cash her monthly U.S. Treasury retirement check at First National Bank, Piedmont Branch. The teller, Brandon Mitchell, demanded additional documentation beyond standard ID requirements, claimed the legitimate Treasury check needed verification, and ultimately refused service despite having cashed identical checks for my grandmother for over 12 years. During the same visit, she observed a white customer receive routine service for what appeared to be a similar government check. This appears to be discriminatory treatment based on race and age. Maya paused. Should I mention the others? Definitely, Betty said. Maya continued typing. We have since learned of at least 3 other customers who experienced similar discriminatory treatment at this branch within the past 6 months, suggesting a pattern of bias rather than isolated incident. Request investigation and corrective action. Form submission sound. Complaint number CF 20240011847. Maya read from the confirmation screen. They say we should receive a response within 15 business days. Next was the Office of the Controller of the Currency. Their form was more formal, more detailed, clearly designed by lawyers for lawyers. Maya worked through it methodically, translating their experience into the precise language bureaucrats preferred. Phone ringings. Treasury Department, Office of Inspector General, how may I direct your call? I'd like to report discrimination related to Treasury benefit payments, Maya said. One moment, please. Hold music, classical and institutional. The inspector who eventually took her call was James Morrison, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd been investigating financial crimes for years. Mrs. Johnson-Chen, you mentioned this involved a Treasury retirement check. Yes, my grandmother's federal retirement benefit. The bank refused to cash it despite having done so routinely for over a decade. And you believe this was discriminatory treatment? Maya described the incident, the witnesses, the pattern of behavior. Morrison asked precise questions, taking notes she could hear through the phone. Mrs. Johnson-Chen, I want you to know we take these complaints very seriously. Denial of access to federal benefits based on discriminatory practices is a federal offense. What happens next? I'll be opening a case file. Someone from our office will likely contact you and your grandmother within the next 2 weeks for a formal interview. In the meantime, document everything. Names, dates, witnesses, any additional incidents. There are other customers who experienced similar treatment. I'd like to speak with them as well. Can you provide contact information? Maya felt a surge of hope. This wasn't disappearing into a bureaucratic black hole. Someone was taking it seriously. Mr. Morrison, can I ask, do complaints like this usually result in changes? When we find evidence of systematic discrimination, absolutely. Banks that receive federal deposits and federal oversight don't get to pick and choose which customers they serve based on personal bias. Community center sounds, chairs scraping, multiple conversations. The Piedmont Community Center's meeting room was fuller than Maya had expected. Word had spread through social media, neighborhood networks, and church communities. What started as a conversation about one bank incident had revealed something much larger. Maya stood at the front of the room, looking at faces both familiar and new. Betty sat in the front row, her posture straight and attentive. Thank you all for coming, Maya began. I know some of you have reached out about similar experiences at First National. I thought it might be helpful to hear everyone's story and talk about what we can do together. Diane Watson raised her hand. She was maybe 60, with silver hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd worked too many double shifts. I'm a retired nurse. Last month, I tried to deposit my pension check, state government pension. The teller questioned whether it was legitimate, asked for additional ID, finally told me to come back with a bank statement proving I regularly received pension payments. Murmurs of recognition around the room. Jennifer Lopez, school district employee, 3 months ago, similar situation with my payroll check. Different teller, same attitude. Finally processed it after making me wait 30 minutes while they verified my employment. Carl Washington spoke from the back of the room. His voice carried military authority despite his advanced age. 26 years in the Army. I tried to cash a VA disability check there in September. They treated me like I was trying to commit fraud. Same branch, Maya asked, though she already knew the answer. Same branch. An elderly woman Maya didn't recognize spoke up. I'm Ruby Phillips. I don't bank there anymore, but last year they refused to cash my Social Security check. Said their policy required additional verification for government benefits over a certain amount. What amount, Maya asked. They wouldn't tell me. Uncomfortable shifting, low murmurs. A middle-aged man near the door cleared his throat. I'm Walter Barnes, I work for the Postal Service. They've never refused my check, but they sure make a production out of it. Extra questions, multiple verifications, calling supervisors. I always figured that was just their process. Do white customers get the same process? Maya asked gently. Walter shook his head. I've watched, they don't. The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of systemic discrimination settling over everyone. So what do we do? Diane asked. I need that bank. It's the closest one to my apartment and I don't drive anymore. Maya had been thinking about this exact question. We file complaints, all of us. Individual complaints with federal agencies carry weight, but multiple complaints about the same institution create a pattern that's impossible to ignore. Will it actually change anything? Carl asked, skepticism in his voice. I spoke with a Treasury investigator yesterday. He's opening a case file. When federal agencies find evidence of systematic discrimination, banks face serious consequences. Fines, oversight requirements, mandated policy changes. Betty spoke for the first time. I've been thinking about this and I keep coming back to something I used to tell my students. One voice can be ignored, but when enough voices speak together, people have to listen. Sounds of agreement, chairs creaking. Maya, Ruby said, what exactly do you need from us? Maya had prepared for this question. Written statements describing your experiences. Specific details, dates, names, exactly what was said. Then formal complaints with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Treasury's Office of Inspector General. I can help people fill out the forms. offered a woman Maya didn't recognize. I'm Linda Martinez, paralegal. I do this kind of paperwork professionally. I can provide notarization, said another voice. I'm Patricia Adams, work at the credit union downtown. Maya felt something shifting in the room. What had started as individual grievances was becoming collective action. There's one more thing, Maya said. The investigator mentioned they might want to interview some of you. Are people comfortable with that? Hands went up around the room, not everyone but enough. When do we start? Diane asked. Maya looked at her grandmother, who nodded encouragingly. We start now. Official car doors closing, footsteps on concrete, professional ambient sounds. James Morrison looked exactly like what Maya had expected from a Treasury Department investigator. Mid-40s, dark suit, briefcase, and the kind of quiet authority that came from years of asking uncomfortable questions and getting straight answers. He'd requested to meet at the community center rather than anyone's home, which Betty appreciated. Neutral territory, she thought, professional setting. Mrs. Johnson, Morrison said, shaking Betty's hand firmly, thank you for taking the time to speak with me. Thank you for taking this seriously, Betty replied. Maya sat beside her grandmother, a folder thick with documents in front of her. Morrison noticed and smiled slightly. I see you've been thorough with your documentation. My granddaughter believes in being prepared, Betty said with pride. Morrison opened his own folder. I've reviewed your complaint and the supporting materials you've provided. I've also received complaints from 4 other customers regarding similar treatment at the same branch. That's what brings this from a customer service issue into potential civil rights violation territory. He looked directly at Betty. I'd like to walk through your experience step by step if you don't mind. For the next 30 minutes, Morrison asked precise questions. Not just what happened, but what Betty observed, what she heard, how she felt, what she saw regarding other customers. He took notes in a small leather portfolio, occasionally asking for clarification. You mentioned observing different treatment of other customers, Morrison said. Can you describe that more specifically? Betty described the elderly white gentleman at the adjacent window, the routine processing of his check, the lack of additional questions or verification delays. And this was during the same time period when your transaction was being refused. Yes, I could see both transactions happening simultaneously. Morrison made more notes. Mrs. Johnson, in your 12 years of banking at this branch, had you ever previously been asked for additional documentation to cash Treasury checks? Oh, never. Had you ever been refused service for any reason? Oh, never. Morrison closed his portfolio. I'd like to visit the bank branch tomorrow. Would you be willing to accompany me? Betty felt her stomach tighten. Am I required to? Not required, but it would be helpful. I find that when bank employees are faced with the actual person they've allegedly discriminated against, along with a federal investigator, their memory of events becomes remarkably clear. Maya leaned forward. What exactly happens during that visit? I interview the teller and branch manager. I review their internal policies and procedures. I examine transaction records for patterns of differential treatment, and I request copies of security footage from the relevant dates. Security footage, Betty hadn't thought about cameras. Banks are required to maintain security recordings. If what you've described actually happened, it will be on camera. Official government building sounds, elevator dings, formal meeting room ambience. The conference room at the Treasury Department's Atlanta field office felt imposing with its official seals and formal table. Betty sat next to Maya, facing a large monitor screen. Morrison was setting up equipment, while Patricia Valdez and Brandon Mitchell sat uncomfortably on the other side of the table. Patricia had not wanted to come. She'd suggested that bank attorneys should be present, that this was premature, that internal policies were proprietary information. Morrison had politely explained that federal investigations didn't work that way. This is security footage from November 15th, approximately 10:30 a.m., Morrison announced, pointing a remote at the screen. The black and white image showed the bank's interior from above. Betty could see herself approaching Brandon's window, documents in hand. Even on grainy security footage, her dignity and preparation were evident. Let's watch this transaction, Morrison said. They watched Betty present her check and ID. Watched Brandon examine the documents with obvious suspicion. Watched him call over his supervisor for a hushed consultation that lasted nearly 3 minutes. Now, Morrison said, let's look at the adjacent window during the same time period. He rewound the footage and focused on the teller station next to Brandon's. An elderly white man approached with what appeared to be a government check. The teller glanced at his ID, typed briefly on her computer, and began counting cash. Total transaction time, 90 seconds. Uncomfortable silence in the room. Morrison paused the footage with both transactions visible side by side. Mr. Mitchell, can you explain the different procedures we're observing here? Brandon stared at the screen, his face pale. The checks were different amounts. Actually, they weren't. Morrison consulted his notes. Mrs. Johnson's Treasury check was for $847. Mr. Patterson's Social Security check was for $1,200, so the larger amount received faster, more routine service. Patricia shifted in her chair. Different types of checks require different verification procedures. What procedures specifically? Morrison asked. According to your bank's own policy manual, which I've reviewed, Treasury checks are considered low-risk government instruments requiring only standard ID verification and computer authentication. He turned back to the screen. Let's continue watching. The footage showed Betty's growing discomfort as the whispered consultation continued, other customers beginning to stare. Betty's hands starting to tremble slightly as she realized she was being treated differently. Mrs. Johnson, Morrison said gently, how did this make you feel? Betty's voice was steady but quiet. Like I was a criminal, like everything I'd accomplished in my life, everything I'd earned didn't matter because of how I looked. Brandon looked down at his hands. Let's see the final interaction, Morrison said. The footage showed Brandon returning to the window, shaking his head, sliding Betty's documents back to her. It showed Betty's momentary shock, then her careful gathering of her papers, her dignified exit. Morrison turned off the monitor. Mr. Mitchell, he said, walk me through your thought process during this transaction. I was trying to be careful. Large government checks can be fraudulent. But you didn't verify it through your computer system. We can see on the footage that you never attempted electronic verification. I called my supervisor, who also didn't verify it electronically. Why? Brandon looked at Patricia, then back at Morrison. The room was completely silent. I don't know, Brandon said finally. Morrison opened another folder. I've reviewed your transaction logs for the past 6 months. You've processed 847 government checks during that period. You've referred 23 to supervisors for additional verification. Would you like to guess the demographic breakdown of those 23 customers? Paper rustling. 21 were customers of color. 2 were elderly white customers, both involving amounts over $5,000. Mrs. Johnson's check was under $900. The numbers hung in the air like an indictment. Ms. Valdez, Morrison continued, as branch manager, were you aware of this pattern? Patricia's professional composure was cracking. I don't review every transaction. But you do review supervisory referrals. You were personally involved in refusing Mrs. Johnson's transaction. What was your reasoning? Brandon said he had concerns about the check's authenticity. Did you verify those concerns? I trusted my employees' judgment. Without doing any actual verification. Patricia said nothing. Morrison gathered his papers. I've seen enough. This footage, combined with the transaction pattern data, provides clear evidence of discriminatory practices in violation of federal civil rights laws. He looked directly at both bank employees. The Treasury Department will be forwarding our findings to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency for regulatory action. Your bank will also be hearing from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Betty spoke for the first time since watching the footage. Will this stop it from happening to others? Morrison nodded. Yes, ma'am, it will. Office ambience, papers shuffling, computer keyboards. 3 days later, Morrison called Maya with an update that was both satisfying and disturbing. The bank's internal audit revealed what we suspected, he said. Systematic patterns of differential treatment, but it goes deeper than just your grandmother's experience. Maya put the call on speaker so Betty could hear. How much deeper, Maya asked. They've been flagging government benefit checks from certain zip codes for additional verification. Guess which zip codes? Maya felt sick, predominantly minority neighborhoods. Exactly. They've also been requiring additional documentation for checks under $1,000 from customers with certain surnames. And their staff training materials included instructions to be especially vigilant about unusual government checks. Unusual how? Betty asked. The training didn't specify, which means tellers were left to use their own judgment about what seemed unusual. The results were predictably biased. Morrison continued. We also found internal emails discussing concerns about high-risk customers. The risk factors they mentioned had nothing to do with banking history or creditworthiness. What were the factors? Maya asked, though she dreaded the answer. Age, race, clothing style, manner of speech. One email specifically mentioned being suspicious of customers who don't look like they should have government checks. Long pause. Betty spoke quietly, so it wasn't just Brandon. No, ma'am, this was institutional policy, even if it wasn't written down officially. The bank created a culture where discrimination was expected and rewarded. What happens now? Maya asked. Several things. The OCC is requiring immediate policy changes and retraining for all staff. The CFPB is imposing fines and ongoing monitoring, and the Justice Department is considering whether criminal charges are appropriate. Criminal charges. Systematic violation of civil rights laws can be prosecuted criminally, especially when it's institutional policy rather than individual bias. Morrison paused. There's something else. We've identified 47 customers who were affected by these discriminatory practices over the past 2 years. The bank will be required to provide remediation, compensation for the inconvenience, embarrassment, and financial hardship they caused. Betty felt a mix of vindication and sadness. Vindication that her experience was being taken seriously. Sadness that 46 other people had gone through similar humiliation. Mrs. Johnson, Morrison continued, your complaint sparked an investigation that will change how this bank operates. But more than that, our findings will be shared with other regulatory agencies. This kind of systematic discrimination is more common than it should be. So other banks will have to change too, Betty asked. The ones that are doing similar things will face scrutiny. Your voice started something bigger than just fixing one branch's behavior. Formal meeting room, serious atmosphere, papers being signed. 6 weeks after Betty's initial humiliation, she found herself back at First National Bank. But this time, she was in the conference room, not at a teller window. And this time, she had federal investigators, bank executives, and lawyers all focused on making things right. The regional bank president, a man named Robert Sterling, looked deeply uncomfortable as he read from a prepared statement. Mrs. Johnson, on behalf of First National Bank, I want to offer you our sincere apology for the discriminatory treatment you received at our Piedmont branch. Your experience was completely unacceptable and contrary to our stated values of serving all customers with dignity and respect. Betty listened politely, her hands folded in her lap. Sterling continued. We have conducted a comprehensive review of our policies and procedures, implemented mandatory bias training for all staff, and established new oversight mechanisms to ensure this never happens again. Morrison leaned forward. Mr. Sterling, can you be more specific about the policy changes? Certainly. First, we've eliminated all subjective criteria for check verification. Staff now follow standardized procedures regardless of customer demographics. Second, we've implemented monthly audits of all supervisory referrals to identify any patterns of differential treatment. Third, we've established a dedicated customer advocacy line for concerns about discrimination. He turned back to Betty. Mrs. Johnson, we're also providing monetary compensation in recognition of the harm caused by our employees' actions. The settlement amount wasn't huge, but it was substantial enough to acknowledge real wrongdoing. More importantly to Betty, it came with admissions of responsibility rather than legal disclaimers. What about training? Maya asked. How do you ensure this cultural change actually happens? The bank's attorney, a sharp-looking woman named Carol Henderson, answered. All staff will complete federal civil rights training within 60 days. New employees will complete it before being allowed to serve customers independently. and we're bringing in external consultants to review our practices quarterly for the next 2 years. Morrison added, the Treasury Department will also be conducting spot audits of this branch's government check processing. Any return to previous practices will result in immediate regulatory action. Betty finally spoke. Mr. Sterling, I appreciate the apology and the policy changes, but I want you to understand something. This wasn't just about my inconvenience. It was about my dignity as a human being. It was about 46 other customers who were made to feel like criminals for trying to access their own money. Sterling nodded gravely. I understand, ma'am. I spent 38 years teaching children to treat everyone with respect, regardless of how they look or where they come from. I hope your bank can learn that lesson too. We will, Mrs. Johnson, you have my word. As they prepared to leave, Morrison pulled Maya aside. The Justice Department decided not to pursue criminal charges, but the civil penalties are substantial. This bank will be operating under federal oversight for the next 3 years. And the employees involved. Brandon Mitchell is being transferred to a non-customer-facing position and required to complete additional training. Patricia Valdez has been demoted. Both will remain employed, but with limited responsibilities until they demonstrate they understand appropriate customer service. Maya nodded. She'd wanted accountability, not destroyed lives. Gentle door chime, welcoming bank atmosphere, respectful voices. 1 month later, Betty walked through the doors of First National Bank for her regular monthly transaction, but everything felt different now. The lobby had new signage prominently displaying customer rights and non-discrimination policies. The staff moved with a new attentiveness, a consciousness that hadn't been there before. Betty approached the teller windows. Brandon Mitchell was nowhere to be seen, transferred to the back office, as Morrison had explained. Instead, she found herself facing a young woman whose nameplate read Angela Santos. Good morning, Mrs. Johnson, Angela said warmly. How can I help you today? The use of her name wasn't accidental. Betty realized that the staff had been briefed, that her face was probably known to every employee in the branch now, not as a troublemaker, but as someone deserving of respect. I'd like to cash my Treasury check, please, Betty said, sliding her documents across the counter. Of course, Angela processed the ID verification quickly and professionally. Her computer verification took exactly 45 seconds. How would you like your cash? Mostly 20s, plays with some 10s. Absolutely, Angela counted out the money with care and respect. Is there anything else I can help you with today, Mrs. Johnson? No, thank you, you've been very professional. Sound of transaction completing. As Betty prepared to leave, Patricia Valdez appeared beside the teller window. She looked different, humbled, more careful. Mrs. Johnson, Patricia said quietly, I wanted to personally apologize for my role in what happened. I failed as a manager and as a person. I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn from my mistakes. Betty studied her face, looking for sincerity. She found it. Ms. Valdez, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do afterward. Yes, ma'am, I understand that now. Betty gathered her purse and walked toward the exit, but before she reached the door, she turned back. The lobby was busy with the usual Tuesday morning customers. She watched the tellers serving everyone with the same professional courtesy, elderly customers, young families, people of all colors and backgrounds, all receiving the same respectful service. Door chime as Betty exits. Outside, Maya was waiting by her car. She'd offered to accompany Betty on this first return visit, but Betty had insisted on going alone. How was it? Maya asked. Betty smiled, different, better, the way it should have been all along. They stood together on the sidewalk, grandmother and granddaughter, watching the normal flow of people in and out of the bank. You know what I'm proudest of, Betty said. We didn't just fix my problem, we fixed it for everyone who comes after us. Maya hugged her grandmother. You taught me that individual voices matter, that one person standing up can create change. And you taught me that sometimes we need help to make our voices heard, Betty replied. That's what family is for. Car doors closing, engine starting. As they drove away, Betty looked back at the bank one more time. It looked the same from the outside, but she knew it was fundamentally different now. Because sometimes the most important changes happen quietly, in daily interactions, in the simple respect of treating every person with dignity. Her monthly routine had been restored, but more than that, her faith in justice had been renewed. 3 months later, Betty received a letter from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Their investigation had been completed, and her case had become part of a broader enforcement action affecting 17 banks across the Southeast. The letter thanked her for her courage in filing a complaint and explained that the policy changes implemented at her bank were now being required industry-wide. Hundreds of employees were receiving civil rights training. Thousands of customers would receive better service. Betty filed the letter carefully in her important documents folder, next to her Treasury Department correspondence and the thank you notes from other customers who had been affected by the discrimination. Maya found her there, organizing papers with the same careful precision she'd brought to 38 years of lesson planning. "Any regrets, Grandma?" Maya asked. Betty considered the question seriously. The experience had been painful, embarrassing, exhausting at times, but it had also been empowering. "No regrets," she said finally. "I learned something important. I learned that my dignity isn't something anyone can take away unless I let them. And I learned that when we speak up about injustice, we're not just speaking for ourselves." She smiled at her granddaughter. "Besides, I had an excellent advocate. You had excellent instincts about what was right and what was wrong. I just helped you navigate the system." Betty stood up, smoothing her dress in the same gesture she'd made countless times in her classroom. "Well then, I guess we make a good team." Outside, the afternoon sun was setting, casting warm light through the windows. Tomorrow would bring another day, another opportunity to treat people with respect, another chance to stand up for what was right. And if anyone ever again tried to deny Betty Johnson the dignity she deserved, they would find themselves facing not just one determined grandmother, but a system of laws and oversight designed to protect every citizen's fundamental rights. The monthly routine continued, but now it carried with it the quiet satisfaction of justice served and changes made. Sometimes the most important victories happen one transaction at a time.